Okay, so let's get down to it. We're going to talk about sphere painting today. Now, some of you may be like, oh, I've painted spheres before. I know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And that may be true, but there's a reason why in Atelier training, we do this exercise multiple times and that we do it at a really high level. For those of you who are new to Atelier training, Atelier is a French word for studio. And it just means that it's a word that represents a type of training in realism that helps you draw and paint at a really hyper realistic level. So that's what atelier training is. And so even if you've painted a sphere before, unless you attended an atelier, you probably have not painted a sphere quite like this. So I'm going to talk you through all of the processes on how to set up this project and the materials that you're going to need. And I'm going to be going live every day at 9 a.m. Monday through Friday until this painting is done. And I'm going to walk you through the entire process. So good to see you. Good morning from upstate New York. Thank you for being here. Yes. And I see some folks have joined, have maybe seen me on Art School Live before. So I'm really excited to learn from the wonderful Eric Rhodes and start live streaming myself and see how it goes. And welcome, Carol Roby. Glad to have you here. Okay, so with the situation, what we're going to do today is that we are going to talk about our setup, how we went about doing it, and how you can make sure to set yourself up for success. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so please forgive my nasally voice this morning. And welcome, Cynthia Galb. So nice to have you. Okay, so I'm going to rotate this around and just kind of show you what I have here. Now, this is a sphere, obviously, and I have it lit so that we're approximately 2/3 in light and 1/3 in shadow. There's an exact place where light turns from shadow. We call this the core shadow. I'll be talking more about this as we go through the project. But step one is that you need a sphere to paint and you want something to be looking at. A lot of people struggle to find a good sphere. Sometimes you can buy plaster ones, but they get dinged and they get dirty. If there's any art teachers here, I work with a lot of art teachers. You may have had this problem with your spheres getting really dirty or getting dinged, or maybe you try the styrofoam ones, but the texture is really distracting to students. So this is actually one of the little secrets in the atelier world. This is actually a light bulb, right? That I've spray painted white. And the reason I prefer doing this is that we get a nice even surface. Having this like little stem of the light bulb actually helps keep it in place so that your ball isn't rolling all over the place. And you can just get a really nice size, right? It's really difficult to find something that is of a decent size. I believe this is a 5 or 6 inch bulb. So it's a really great way to get a sphere cheaply, easily, get some spray paint. In atelier world, white spray paint is your best friend because when you're first starting, you're learning about values and you can spray paint anything white all day long, right? To practice your values. Like you can go buy dolls at the thrift store and spray paint them white and learn about, the shapes of the face or things like that. So there's a lot of good options out there with some white spray paint for you. Okay, so we have the sphere. Now, the next thing to think about is your background, what you're placing the sphere in. So I actually have the sphere in a shadow box, and this is to help control the light. What you don't want is light bouncing around from every which way. You want one singular light source. In this case, I have light coming from above here, from this window, hitting the sphere in this direction. If you don't have a high window, what you can do is you can, on a regular window, block out the lower half of the window and it'll give you a pretty clean light. You can also, excuse me, you can also use an artificial light. So a clamp light directed onto your sphere will also work. I have an example here. So, one of these bendy lights is really great because it gives you like a lot of flexibility on how you clip them. So if you don't have natural light or you prefer a less mercurial source, so I personally love natural light, but it is different day to day. You have sunny days, cloudy days, time change days, right? So if you want to eliminate variation in light, using an artificial light is perfectly legitimate. So you can, but I like these bendy lights because then you can get the light exactly where you want it. Okay. Oh, and I see some other people joining, and that have seen maybe some other episodes, either from my YouTube channel at School of Atelier Arts, or Art School Live. We have a great Atelier community, and I love seeing how everybody's joining online. Okay, so we have oh, and welcome from Oman as well. Welcome, Kareem. All right, so we have so far, in theory, a light bulb. We have it in a shadow box to help control our light source. We have a light source, and we want to think about the background. Now, you'll see that I have a whitish cloth in the background. Some people prefer having their light bulb in a black shadow box because it just really stands out. That's a perfectly legitimate way to work as well. So if you want like a really dramatic sphere, it's actually common in some ateliers where they will have you paint the sphere 3 different times, which is astonishing. Once we go through the whole process, you'll understand why that's such a big deal. Once on a black background, once on a white background, and once on a medium background, because it really helps you master your paint handling and master your values. And after we get through this project, you'll understand why that's the case. So, okay, so we have the sphere. We have chosen a background, either a black, a light, or a medium value. We're going to be painting in what's called en grisaille, which means we're only using black and white to paint this. And so we don't want to distract ourselves by putting a color in our background. We want to keep it as grisaille as possible. We want it to not be about color. We want it to be really focused on values and how to paint value and control our paint in a really refined and nuanced way. So do not use color. Use a white, a black, or a gray, right? So try to keep color out of it. Now, those of you who've worked with me before are probably screaming in your head, but Mandy, you say that gray is a color, and it is. But for this purpose, for a grisaille, you know what I mean, like a grayish looking color, like the background wall here. Okay, so we have the sphere. We talked about the lighting. I also want to talk about the setup, and I just realized I have this plant sticking out here. I'm going to rotate him out of the way. Okay, so we obviously need a surface to paint on. There are a lot of choices out there, but there are good choices and less good choices, and I want to make sure that you guys know the difference between the two. My favorite for doing these demos is this kind of oil primed linen. I'm going to hold it up close and see if you can see the texture on here. It's a fairly fine weave, okay? Sometimes students will come into my class or come into the online Atelier bootcamp that I teach, and they have some canvas already that they want to use, and it's this really crappy, cheap cotton weave canvas with a really rough texture, and that is going to be especially hard for this project. So if you do have a rough canvas that you're just determined that you have to use, one thing that you can do is put gesso down on it and then sand it just to get it a slightly smoother surface. Because if you have a really, really rough surface, this project is going to hurt your soul, right? So especially for the sphere, try to get a smoother weave on your canvas. And welcome to Magritte from Virginia. I'm so happy to have you here. Okay, now I like to tape my canvas. If I'm using a thin canvas board like this, I like to tape it onto my board, but I want to be mindful as I'm doing this because there are good ways to place it onto your board and bad ways to place it onto your board. A lot of people think that, oh, you're an Atelier artist, Mandy. You just sit down and you sit in front of a canvas and you paint in one corner and go all the way to the other corner, and then voila, it's done. That's not at all how anything works. That is not how it works. There's so much thought that goes into setting something up appropriately for your projects. And when you set yourself up well, you have an easier time learning. When you are fighting your materials and your placement and your setup and your light, things don't go as well for you. And I, of course, want everything to go very well for you. So we're going to talk about how what I would like to do. First of all, I have to figure out if I want to do vertical or horizontal. Now, with my sphere, and I've been kind of moving it around, I want it over here. When you're placing your sphere in your box, I'm going to show you a little bit more. And you know what? I'm going to put this a little bit higher. I want you to see it closer from my eye height than where you are. So let me just bump this one more time. All right. Yeah, that's a little bit closer. We might need you to go a little bit higher than that. Usually I use my iPad that I can adjust, but with the streaming software, it's making me use my computer. So this is a new adjustment for me in my teaching. Okay, this is much closer. I wanted you to be able to see the cast shadow the way that I'm seeing it while we're going through this project. And let's just get you all nice and close. Okay. All right, so with your setup, you have a sphere. So in theory, if you're painting just a sphere, it doesn't matter if your canvas is vertical or horizontal, in theory. However, we're not just painting a sphere, we're painting a sphere in an environment. And it's really important when you're painting something in the environment that you consider the overall composition when you are placing your canvas to start painting. Even something as simple as, are you doing vertical or horizontal? So in this case, because I have a sphere plus a cast shadow over here, and I want to include both in my painting, I'm going to choose horizontal because horizontal is going to give me the ability for the sphere plus the cast shadow here. And welcome, Susan from Virginia. Glad to have you here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape this onto here. And you would think that I could just freaking tape it already, right? Like I've been yakking about this canvas for easily 5 minutes now, but it also matters how high or low that I place this. Now, from your point of view, where the camera is showing right now, do you see that it would be much easier for me to have my canvas placed here because my eye is going immediately across, right? Maybe even just a little bit lower, right? I can look here, go across, and it's going to be where I want it on my canvas. If I have it really high, do you see how I have to start looking diagonally? That's bad. Nix Nux new. We don't want that. We don't want to make anything harder than it already is to learn how to paint. Welcome, Frankie. Good to have you. And welcome, Marie. So happy to have you here from France. Ooh la la. Welcome. So what we do want is to have it so that when we're looking at our subject and painting on our canvas, that we're doing a horizontal motion. We don't want to be doing that kind of thing. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and tape my canvas so that I am able to look directly across. Now, I obviously cannot have the camera exactly at where my eyes are, or I wouldn't be able to see through the computer to my subject. So there's going to be a tiny bit of a difference between where I place this and where you see it, because I'm going to put it at my eye height to make sure. So there's just a little bit of difference from your point of view. So heads up. Excuse me. Okay, so what I like to do is just put a little bit over the edge. And I'll put like 2 sides down, and then I'll start taping it on. All right, so I'm going to place this, and it looks like I need to tighten this down a little bit. All right, so I'm going to place this so that my canvas, from my point of view, is going directly across. I'm just double checking that. All right, that's a tiny bit high. I'm going to lower it a little bit. Now I can lower it by taping it, or because I have an adjustable easel, I can just lower this a tiny hair. There we go. Okay, so this needs to go over just a touch so that I can see everything. Okay, so that's feeling pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and tape the rest of it on. So feel free to ask any questions you might have in the chat. This is my first time doing a full live stream, so I'm still learning how to paint and look at the chat and say hello to everybody at the same time. But please don't hesitate to ask. And if I miss your question, please don't hesitate to ask it twice, just so that I make sure to get everybody's questions answered. All right. So we have a sphere. We have a canvas. We've aligned it. I'm going to rotate this so you're seeing it a little closer to, actually, I wonder if I can get this even more spot on. Okay. So we're going to be working side by side here. Now, from my point of view, this edge of the board is lined up here, and that's so that I don't have this distraction. So do you see this plant over here? So what I'm going to try to do is eliminate this distraction for you guys by just putting you a little closer, and hopefully that's still enough for me to be able to see. All right, it's a little tight, but I want you guys to have the best view. Okay, so we have the sphere, we have the canvas, and now we are ready to do the last part of our setup, which is drawing the sphere on the canvas. Now, you can draw the sphere the hard way, which is, trying to eyeball it and draw a perfect sphere, or you can do it my preferred way and just trace something round. Now, you want something that is approximately the same size as your sphere. This one's a little bit on the big side, although it's actually pretty close. All right, so I think we'll be okay using this as our example. Especially, I don't mind erring a tiny bit on the big side because this is a demo, and the bigger I paint it, the more you guys are going to get out of it. But a roll of tape works well. If you have small dishes, I inherited a bunch of little teacup saucers from my great grandmother. Those I often use when I need a different size circle. But anything round that you can trace is useful in this scenario. I just need to grab my pencil here. Okay, now we're literally tracing a circle. How hard can this be? But if you've been following me and learning from me, you know that there's a lot more to every step that we do than what appears at first glance, right? So what I want to do is, when I'm thinking about my circle, is I want to be really mindful about where I put my circle on my canvas. Now, most students are going to be like, a circle, a canvas, I'm going to put it right in the middle. Does anybody know why I might not want to put my sphere directly in the middle of my canvas? Let me know in the chat if you have any ideas about why that might not be the best idea to do. I like asking the questions. I like it when you guys talk to me because it's weird sometimes being alone in my studio talking into the internet world. I don't know. This is a new learning experience for all. Excellent. So Peter's throwing it out there. The shadow, right? Remember that this isn't a painting about a sphere. This is a painting about a sphere within an environment, including its shadow. And our shadow is quite substantial. It's taking up some space here. If I put my sphere in the middle of my page, my shadow might get run off this edge, and I don't particularly like that as a design. But by placing it slightly over to the side, that gives me space for the shadow. Now, I've also seen students, after explaining this, like, oh yes, think about your shadow, think about the entire environment. I've sometimes had students put the sphere all the way to this edge, right? But keep in mind compositionally that we want this painting to be about the sphere, right? And we want to make it the star of our show. That's the intent of this painting. So if I put this all the way over to the edge, what happens is that this negative space starts to get really skinny and sharp and interesting, and it starts fighting us for our attention for the sphere itself. So I don't want it straight in the center because I want room for the shadow, but I don't want it touching the edge or too close to the edge because I don't want this negative shape to be more interesting than the sphere itself. Excuse me. So I also want to think about how high up or how down, how high down, how high up or how far down that I want to place my circle, because this has effects as well. Now, generally speaking, it's nice to give some space for the bottom to breathe, right? If I put this exactly in the middle, top to bottom, I don't have a ton of breathing room for my eye down here. And sometimes, especially when we're painting objects, especially really symmetrical objects, this one has a lot of form. It's kind of nice to give it a little bit of breathing room on the bottom, just a little bit of extra room on the bottom. This is for two reasons. One is that we want to have enough space to show, this is called the ground plane, right? So just a little review on what the planes are. Back here, this is called the back plane. Pretty easy. What the sphere is sitting on is called the ground plane. And this little bit on front here is a plane change, and we call this the front plane. So front plane, ground plane, back plane. All right. Now, if I put the sphere directly in the middle, there's a little bit of space before it hits before the ground plane hits the front plane. And then, I don't really have a lot of space for the front plane. Whereas if I elevate my sphere just a little bit, do you see how it gives me plenty of room for this ground plane? And if I want to include it, the front plane down here. So because of the shadow, I'm going to put my sphere slightly to the left. And because I want to include this front plane in my composition, I'm going to put my sphere slightly above halfway from bottom to top. Okay, so I'm going to think about this. I think that's a little too far to the left. I'm going to move it just a little bit closer to center. I want it a little bit higher than lower. I'm trying to imagine what this would look like with the shadow. I'm going to move it just a little bit over because I have plenty of room for the shadow here, and maybe just a touch more, just a little bit. All right, once I'm happy, I'm going to place it with a pencil. I know that this is a little thing, but do you see how I changed my hand position so that the angle of my pencil is always kind of perpendicular to what I'm drawing? Sometimes, like this circle is really, really important. The circle is the most important thing for making sure that our final sphere feels round. That's why we're tracing the circles. We need it very, very round. And if you do part of the circle drawing like this, and part of the circle with your pencil in close, you're going to get a distorted sphere. So it's really important that you keep your pencil perpendicular to your circle. Okay, and voila, we have a sphere. Now, I'm going to take a step back, and it looks like, from my point of view, that my canvas is just a little bit high because my intention is I want to look from left to right and have my sphere be right directly across without having to look up a little bit or to look down a little bit. So I'm going to lower my easel just a touch. But setup is so important. People try to rush through the setup. They're like, oh, I'm just going to throw a sphere down and start. But if you start slow, you can finish fast. If you start fast, you're going to make a mess. Setup is so, so, so important. Okay, so let's see how that goes. And I need to lower it just a touch more. Just a hair. Okay, so I'm taking a look at that, and that's feeling pretty good. I'm a little bit on the big side, but because this is a demo and I want to make sure that you guys see really well and really get the detail of what I'm doing, because this is a highly rendered project. So, sometimes maybe you've seen me do the poster studies. That's a loose study, right? We're not doing a really highly refined detail. This painting is highly refined detail. So it's important, in the setup that I'm painting large enough and drawing dark enough that you can see everything. But if you were my students, I would say that this circle is just a tiny bit too big because it's bigger than life. And whenever you paint something bigger than the way you see it, it starts to feel cartoony somehow, usually. So I'm making exception because I feel like the bigger sphere will be better for you as viewers. But as you're setting up your own projects at home, try to draw a circle no bigger than the size of the object is in real life. Okay, so we we have been hanging out for a half hour already, and we have drawn. We didn't even draw it. We traced a circle. Who feels accomplished? So if you're still with me, congratulations. You have done a lot of the important work of learning how to set up your project for success. Excuse me. Man, this cold just will not go away. Okay, so we have a sphere. We also want to pay attention and make note of the back plane, the ground plane, and the front plane. So one way to do this is to look at the overall height, the top and the bottom of your sphere, and ask yourself, at what point does this back plane meet the ground plane? So this line that's being created between, I don't know if you guys can see that. It's more obvious on this side. All right, this line, and I'm just going to fix my drapery a little bit here. This line between the back plane and the ground plane is cutting through the sphere, right? And a lot of people will just make a guess. They'll be like, oh, it's cutting through the sphere, and they'll put it exactly halfway through the middle. But it's not halfway through the middle. In fact, can you tell me from your point of view where you guys are seeing it, is this line between the ground plane and the back plane at the halfway point, below the halfway point, or above the halfway point of the sphere? So the question again is, where this ground plane meets the back plane, this line here, is that happening from your point of view, from what you're seeing on the video right now? Is it at the halfway, below the halfway, or above the halfway? Excellent. Thank you, Leela. Thank you, Carol. Yes, it is below the halfway point. So we don't ever blindly make marks on our canvas. Think of how much thought we put about the placement of the circle. We need just as much thought about the placement of that line between the ground plane and the back plane. Now, again, my view is slightly different from the view that you're getting here because the camera and my eye can't be in the same place at the same time. But what I'm going to do in order to get the most precise placement of this line is I'm going to pretend that the bottom of the sphere is 0 and the top of the sphere is 100. And I'm going to ask myself, if the bottom is 0 and the top is 100, at what number would that ground plane meeting the back plane meet? And again, it's going to be slightly different from my point of view than yours. But from my point of view, if the bottom of the sphere is 0 and the top is 100, I'm getting it at about 30%. All right. So 30%, I'm guessing, is about here. So I'm just going to make a little mark. I'll try to mark darker so that you guys can see it better in the video. Just going to make a little point there. And then I'm going to double check. Do I think that it's still about a third? And if so, is my mark at about a third of the way up? And I'm feeling like my mark is just a tiny touch high compared to where I'm seeing it. And again, it's a little bit different for me than it is for you. Also, as a side note, this sphere drawing, this tracing we did, is the most important, most sacred thing of this painting. And anytime it gets disturbed, you have to immediately fix it while you still have the visual memory of exactly where that line goes. So I just did a little bit of erasing here, and it erased a bit of my line. I have to put it in immediately. As soon as you lose your drawing, you are not in a good place. I'm like, Maddie, you're live. Watch your language. So you want to make sure that you treat this circle with absolute sacred authority, and that anytime it gets smudged a little bit, especially when we get to the painting part, that you are perfect in maintaining your drawing. Those of you who work with me, so in the online Atelier Painting Bootcamp, we meet online twice a week, and we critique and I coach students and give them Atelier training. And those students, I see some of them here today. How many of you have lost a drawing when you were painting, right? And it's a really common thing. So for those of you who are new to Atelier training that might be joining the first time, maybe this is your first Atelier project, you will learn that this line is sacred. It is so sacred. We don't want to lose our drawing, especially when we're new to Atelier painting. Yeah. I see when the students in the chat being like, yes, it's very easy to happen. Indeed. Indeed it is. So, and also I'd like to point out that I'm an Atelier trained artist. I've painted a lot of spheres at this point. Hopefully this is going to be a fairly straightforward, smooth process where from beginning to end, I don't make any mistakes and it's a perfect painting, right? But in order to do that, I had to make a lot of really crappy spheres, right, through the years. So if this is your very first time painting a sphere, please paint along with me, but also be kind to yourself. So follow the directions, set yourself up for success, but also recognize that like many things that we're trying to learn, it might take a few attempts to get it. And if you do lose your drawing, guess what? It's not that freaking hard to get a new canvas and trace a new circle, okay? You can always start again if you really lose your drawing, all right? So, you know, this is a learning process. Try not to treat this project as a sacred painting that represents your, you know, artistic soul. This is a project instead for learning new techniques and honing your paint handling skills. So if you treat it as a learning process, then it takes some of that pressure off to like be perfect and have this perfect thing going on. This is a learning process. This is a learning project. It's one that you will probably do a few times before you really master it. And so just be kind to yourself as you're going through this. Okay. All right. So back to what we were up to. All right. Now, I want to put this ground plane meeting the back plane through. I just want to double check. Again, I'm thinking the bottom is 0, the top is 100. And I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I'm noticing something, and this is a mistake that students will make, and I'm not sure how obvious it is from your point of view here, but my board is slightly crooked. And if I have a slightly crooked board, I'm going to make a slightly crooked painting. And also, it looks like I taped this on slightly crooked to my board, which is not ideal. The only thing that I really need to make sure of is that there's a perfectly horizontal going through here. And when I'm looking at this, my top corner is just a little bit high. So I'm going to make this adjustment now because I don't want to draw my whole painting a little bit cattywampus. All right, so just a small adjustment, like I literally rotated it maybe 1/8 of an inch. But now, in theory, my canvas is perfectly horizontal. That's much better. All right, it's all these little things that add up and make a difference in your painting. Okay, so back to double checking, 0 to 100. And I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I'm going to put a horizontal line. And okay, question for all of you. I put my mark here. Why would I start my line over here? Well, another mistake that students often make is they'll be like, oh, I'll put the horizon here. And then all of a sudden on this side of the sphere, it's 1 inch higher or lower, right? So whenever you're creating any sort of plane meeting plane line, you need to think through your object. It needs to be the same height on this side as it does on this side. Otherwise, I can't tell you how common it is that, this side will be down here and this side will be up here, and students don't catch it, right? So we want to think through as you're doing this. So I'm going to create the line. I'm lifting up to go across here. It looks like I hit my mark just a little bit low. Was that subconsciously done? All right, so it needs to be just a touch higher. All right. Okay, so I'm going to erase the line that I don't want. So if you ever put down more than one mark, only one mark is the right mark. Don't ever leave your wrong marks on your page. And I'm seeing that that's not quite showing up very well in the video, so I'm going to draw it a little bit darker. Just want to make sure that it's where I want it. And I feel pretty good about that. All right, so I'm going to darken this for the video. When you're doing this on your own, oops, I guess I subconsciously straightened it. That's not terrible. Okay, I'm a little bit higher than my mark, and I'm wondering if I'm subconsciously trying to make it higher because there's a visual trick, or if my mark, I had moved it lower, but now that I have the line drawn in there, I actually think it needs to be just a slight bit higher where I put my line. So I'm going to erase this mark. I'm going to repair my circle. Always, always, always repair your circle. And then it looks like this part of my line started drooping down a little bit, that it wasn't quite straight. So I'm just going to lift it up slightly. Some people will straight up use a ruler. That's legitimate. Actually, I want to address that. Should you use a ruler or should you not? Okay, there are two rules of thoughts about using a ruler when you are drawing, because often drawing a straight line is a skill that takes some practice for students to develop. And so here's the two schools of thought, and I'm not here to tell you yes one way, not the other, or vice versa, but I will explain why why this is so contentious in the ateliers and why they have such strong opinions about it on both sides. So one school of thought is it's so hard to learn how to draw that any tool that will help you learn how to draw, such as a ruler, should be embraced. The other opposing view is that learning how to draw a straight line is such an essential skill to becoming an atelier trained artist that if you don't practice it without a ruler, that you are hindering your education, right? And you're hindering your abilities. So those are the two schools of thought. Now, I actually fall into the category of I will let my students use rulers because I find that eventually they exhaust themselves, they get tired of using it, and then go freehand anyways. And meanwhile, they don't have this anxiety about if only I had a ruler, right? So I let my students use rulers. I find that they eventually go freehand because the ruler becomes unwieldy after some time. But that being said, for something like this, a ruler, I see, really well-trained painters use a ruler all the time for something like this. So it's really up to you. I personally prefer freehanding. I find that it adds a little bit more charm and a little less mechanical feel. I like just a slight imperfection. And also with this meeting plane, even though we see the line back there where the ground plane is meeting the back plane, it's a very soft edge. So, we're not going to have a crisp edge anyways in the end. So for me, a ruler, if you really need a crisp plane change, that's the great use for a ruler. But this is going to be a really soft plane change. And so having a precise line isn't really going to help us for this particular visual problem. and Peter, that's a good point. If you use a roll of tape, you should be allowed to use a ruler. That's legitimate. That's a fair argument. So it's up to you. I'm not saying don't use a ruler, but you will get a slightly different effect. A ruler and tracing a perfect circle is going to give you a more crisp mechanical feel versus doing it hand drawn is going to give it a little bit of charm, if you will. Excuse me. Yes, and Ram agrees with you too, Peter. So speaking of circles, in many ateliers, going way back, being able to draw a freehand circle was considered, a true mastery over your drawing. And you can see student drawings sometimes from the École des Beaux-Arts or others where they're practicing. And there's that famous Rembrandt painting with a perfect circle behind him. That was his way of being like, look what I can do, right? Like he was trying to prove to his naysayers that he was a great draftsman because he was often criticized for how badly he drew hands. So anyways, freehanding a circle, you can do that too, but there's so much to learn, especially if you're new to Atelier training. If you're new to painting at a really high level, do not freehand a circle for this project. You're paint like 4 or 5 spheres and then freehand it if you really want to try it, but do not fight that battle when there's so many other things to learn from this project right now. Like one thing that I tell my students all the time in our online atelier is, do tackle one problem at a time, right? Don't try to solve 5 problems at a time. Pick one problem, solve that, then go to the next problem. So, we don't want to create a problem of learning how to draw a circle. That's not what this project is about. We do want to learn how to render at a really high level in paint. And a sphere is the ultimate rendering project in paint. If you can create with your paint a perfectly formed sphere that doesn't look dented, that doesn't look blobby, that doesn't look like it melted a little bit, then that's true mastery over your paint. And that is the intent of this project. And that's going to be like our North Star as we're making decisions. Like, how is this going to help me learn how to render better in paint? That's the point. Okay. So, all right, we have this back plane meeting the ground plane. We also need the front plane meeting the ground plane. Now, this is also a really soft plane change. Oh, you guys can't see. Do you see how soft this edge is around here from the top plane to this front plane? Because the fabric is softly folding over the edge. It's not a crisp, cut edge here. But we still, even when we have a soft edge, we have to determine exactly where it is. So I need to ask myself, how much space do I have between the bottom of my sphere and this plane change? So I'm going to guess it's a little tricky because we also have this cast shadow, and it's easy to ignore the space the cast shadow is taking up because it's dark in value. So it's tempting to only show a skinny bit, but really there's quite a bit more distance to the bottom of the sphere to where this plane change happens than it appears, because the cast shadow is kind of tricking our eye a little bit. It's taking up a little bit of the space. So in fact, actually, before we do this, why don't we put in the cast shadow, because then we'll know exactly how much space it takes up. So the cast shadow is an ellipse. Now, some of you, especially the students in the online atelier, sorry, excuse me. Especially my students in the online atelier painting bootcamp. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. We talk about ellipses a lot, right? But ellipses take so much time to learn and so many attempts to learn how to do really well. But I want to give you the abbreviated ellipse lecture right now so that you understand why I'm drawing the ellipse the way that I'm doing it. If you want a really in-depth lecture on ellipses, please consider joining our Atelier Painting Bootcamp. I have, I'm sure, multiple hours at this point on ellipses in that class and the bonus materials. Okay, so what is happening is that in our little project here, the light is coming from here. It's being interrupted from this by the sphere itself. So the sphere is blocking the light and it's casting a shadow down here. Essentially what's happening is it's a circle, right? It's hitting that sphere, and then that circle has collapsed down to create the cast shadow. Now, I want you to do something really silly with me. So like get your childlike mind on here. Have you ever played that children's game where you put like the bottom of your thumb on the bottom of a chin and the top of your finger on the top of a head, and then you're like, oh, I squished your head? Have you ever seen kids play that game? So humor me and put your thumb on my chin and your finger on the top of my head and squish my head. You got me, in theory. I hope you're all doing it. Please do it. Because the next step is I want you to do the same thing with this circle. I want you to put your thumb so that it's on the bottom of the circle, and your finger, I'm trying to align this so that it's the same. I'm like trying to see. Okay. And your finger, and I want you to squish this circle. All right. So now what I want you to do is keep your thumb on the bottom and your finger on the top, no matter what happens to the circle. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start rotating this circle back. And what happens to your fingers as I start rotating the circle away from us? So what's happening is that this ellipse is collapsing. So ellipse is just a circle that starts collapsing, and it becomes more oval in nature, and it gets skinnier and skinnier and skinnier the more that it's tilted away from you. If I have this tape at your eye height, you don't see the top or the bottom. There's no circle here, right? As soon as I lower it a little bit, you see a skinny, skinny ellipse. Do you see how skinny this ellipse is on top? And if I lower it a little bit more, oh, look, you're seeing a slightly fatter ellipse. Oh, it's lowered more. Look how fat the ellipse is now, right? So what's happening is that we need to determine this ellipse. If that circle was at our eye height, we would just see a line for the ellipse, but it's not. It's lower than our eye height. And because it's lower, we're seeing some width to that ellipse. So, excuse me. All right, so I need to figure out how wide my ellipse is. And I see that my ellipse is starting just a little bit below that line where our ground plane and our back plane meets. And it is coming out of about here on the sphere, and it's dipping lowish like here. And then I also need to figure out how far over it's going. So I am seeing it go about here. All right, so I've kind of created some parameters. I've created the top, where I think the top of my ellipse is in relation to the sphere, where the bottom is in relation to the sphere, where the left side is in relation to the sphere, and where the right side is in relation to the sphere. I'm thinking that feels pretty good. Okay. Notice that every sentence I just said, and let me show you so you can see, every sentence I just said is, where's the top, bottom, left side, and right side in relationship to the sphere, right? We can't ever make a drawing choice without relating it to the whole. In this case, the whole is mostly the sphere because that's like 90% of what this painting is, right? I could make an ellipse the right width that was way too short or way too long, right? But what I need to do is figure out how far away from this edge does it actually go in proportion to the sphere. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to recreate that ellipse that I'm seeing using these markers as a general idea of where the ellipse goes. That's an okay idea. All right, we're gonna say-ish that I feel like this corner needs to be a little more subtle here. Nope. Ellipses are painful sometimes. You can fight with an ellipse over and over and over again. I think this is just started a touch high. All right, remember what I said, if you make a couple marks, erase back. If you're not sure, erase all your marks. And if you mess up your sphere in any way, immediately fix it. All right, so I think it was just a touch lower in here. All right, a sphere is something that you can fight with for ages. We're going to fight it again when we get to painting. We're going to fight it again. You know, I have a few marks here, and I want to make sure that I have the one true mark, not the wrong marks. So I'm cleaning up as I go. To adjust the C-lips. All right, that's feeling pretty good to me. So I'm just going to stand back, take a look. That's feeling pretty okay. Okay, so now that we have the ellipse in there, we also need the change from the ground plane to the front plane. And that's telling me that my lips actually got a tiny bit low because this is taking up too much space. So I'm going to shorten this ellipse just a touch. Because I had made it the right proportion, but that proportion was slightly too big in size compared to how big the sphere was. I had made it too big down here. All right, is that still making sense? All right, that's actually feeling much better. I'm checking things like how much space is there between the edge of the sphere and here, how much space is between the edge of the sphere and here. That's feeling pretty okay. Okay, and now I'm seeing that my ground plane is giving just a little skinny space between that ellipse. I think it's just a touch lower. I'm pretending that I see that line through before I draw it. Well, I think it's a little higher than that. Halfway between my two guesses. Okay, and you could use a ruler or not a ruler here. Not my straightest of lines. It is going to be a soft edge eventually. How do I feel about that? And this got just a little ahead of itself over here. Okay. All right, so we are more or less set up for tomorrow, where we're going to actually start painting. Okay, so Peter has a really good question here. Actually, two really good questions. So one is you could relate the proportion of the ellipse to the proportion of the sphere. So you could take either the radius or the diameter. I find that usually taking the width of the big object and comparing it to the cast shadow. And when I do this, when I measure, let me show both here. When I measure the width of my cast shadow and compare it to the width of my sphere, I'm getting that they're almost the same. So I'm going to double check here that, okay, here's the width of my sphere, and my cast shadow in this example is almost the same. Now, that's a coincidence. Depending on the angle of your light, it could be really, really long. It could be twice as long as your sphere, or it could be really, really short if the light is above. So this is just a happy coincidence that it's almost a 1-to-1 width to width here. And then also, Peter's noticing that the shadow hits the sphere about a third of the way down from the back plane. Let me think about what you're saying. The shadow hits the sphere a third of the way down. I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you could say that in a different way, then I'll try to address that. So keep in mind too that, again, because the camera it cannot be in the exact same place as my eye, that we're going to have a slight differential between what you guys are seeing and what I'm seeing here. But for this project, especially when we are rendering out the sphere, this is one of the rare projects where we're going to be talking a lot about the theory of light, and we're also going to be using our eyes to observe, and we're going to be combining those two things. Typically in the Atelier, you're doing a true observation only, but with the sphere, sometimes in order to see the nuances of changes that we're going to be talking about throughout this project, you have to apply the theory before your eye is good enough to see it, right? So we're going to have some really interesting conversations over the next week or so as we work through this project to figure these things out. All right, so I got some clarity here from the intersection of the background and ground planes to the front plane. Oh, I see. So Peter's talking about between this line separating the ground plane to the back plane and this line that the sphere is hitting. What did you originally say that it was a third? Shadow hits the sphere about a third of the way down. Okay, so you're seeing a little bit more space here, I think is what you're saying. I am not, but be careful. One, we're looking at two different places, and two, we have a really, really soft edge from that back plane to the ground plane. So one thing that happens with Atelier training, when you have a really soft edge, when you have a really crisp edge, it's really obvious, right? I drew a crisp edge here, top to bottom. It's exactly here. Sometimes you have edges that are like this wide, right? And so if you're trying to measure from a soft edge, are you measuring from the top of it? Are you measuring from the bottom of it? Are you measuring from the middle of it? So depending on how you see your soft edges, it's going to affect where you might draw that line. Some students, and myself included, will consider the line through the center. Some will only consider it where the light exactly changes to dark at the bottom. Some will do it where they see the darkest part ends at the top. So we're getting a little esoteric and into the weeds here, but do be mindful when you have a soft edge, are you measuring from the top, middle, or bottom of it? Because you need to be accurate in your drawing, but how can you be accurate if you don't know exactly what that line represents and where on that edge it's representing? But that's a really good point, Peter. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay. All right, so it is almost 10 o'clock. Thank you for joining me for my first live stream. You are a fabulous audience. I appreciate your support. And we will continue working on this project at 9 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow. So please make sure if you aren't on our mailing list to join. You don't want to miss out on any of the free goodies. You can do so at schoolofatelierarts.com. If you enjoy this free class, I know that you would love our online Atelier Painting Bootcamp. We meet with students twice a week. They get critiques on their project, which is the most important thing. Right now, you guys are getting a lot of good information, and I hope that you're going to practice it. But if you really want to master it, you need an Atelier person checking your work and giving you feedback on it. So if you are ready to take that serious leap into Atelier training, I hope you'll consider joining us in our online Atelier Painting Bootcamp. All right. Thank you, everybody, and I hope to see you tomorrow.